The humidity that evening felt like a heavy, wet blanket draped over my shoulders as I stood on the porch of the only home I had ever known. In my hands were two black industrial trash bags, the plastic straining against the sharp corners of my few textbooks and a handful of clothes. The porch light flickered, casting a stuttering yellow glow over my father's face as he stood in the doorway, blocking the path back inside. Behind him, I could see the soft, warm light of the living room reflecting off the leather interior of the new luxury sedan he had bought himself just 3 days prior. It sat in the driveway, a shimmering silver monument to his professional success. My mother stood slightly behind him, her eyes cold and dry, checking her watch because they had a dinner reservation to get to. It was my 16th birthday. There was no cake on the counter and no cards on the table. Instead, there was a stack of my belongings and a door that was about to be locked. My father didn't look sad. He didn't even look angry. He looked inconvenienced, like he was finally taking out a bag of garbage that had been sitting in the kitchen for too long. He told me that they had done their part and that the legal obligation of parenthood was a social construct he no longer felt like entertaining. He looked me dead in the eye and said that I was a financial drain on their lifestyle. He talked about his upcoming 3-week tour of Europe and the cost of the first-class tickets as if my existence were a direct theft from his retirement fund. I remember the sound of my mother's jewelry clinking as she crossed her arms. She didn't offer a hug or a $20 bill. She just nodded in agreement when he told me that I was a man now and it was time for me to figure it out on my own. I asked where I was supposed to go, and he just gestured toward the street with a lazy wave of his hand. The irony wasn't lost on me even then. I had worked a part-time job since I was 14, and every cent I made went into a shared account they had emptied the night before to pay for their vacation incidentals. I was the one who had been contributing, yet I was the one being discarded for being too expensive to keep. He didn't care about the logistics of where a teenager sleeps or how a child eats when he has no ID and no roof. To them, I was just a line item that needed to be deleted so their profit margins could look better for the next quarter. He stepped back and began to close the door, the heavy oak frame moving slowly as if to emphasize the finality of the moment. My mother's last words weren't a goodbye or a warning to stay safe. She just told me to make sure I didn't leave any trash on the lawn because the neighbors might complain about the eyesore. Then, the click of the deadbolt echoed through the quiet neighborhood. I stood there for a long time, listening to the muffled sounds of them laughing inside as they got ready for their steak dinner. The streetlights came on, one by one, stretching my shadow across the pavement. I realized then that the people who were supposed to be my safety net were actually the ones who had pushed me off the ledge. I walked to the end of the driveway and didn't look back, carrying the weight of my life in 2 plastic bags. I survived that night, and many nights after that, through sheer spite and the cold realization that I was truly alone. But 15 years later, the phone rang, and the voice on the other end was the same one that told me to rot in the street. The silence that followed that night lasted for a decade and a half, a vast and hollow canyon where my parents used to be. I didn't have the luxury of a grieving period because hunger is a very effective distraction from a broken heart. While other kids my age were worrying about prom themes or college applications, I was mastering the art of the 3-job grind. I spent my mornings scrubbing industrial kitchens, my afternoons stocking warehouse shelves, and my nights delivering pizzas in a rusted sedan that doubled as my bedroom. There is a specific kind of bone-deep exhaustion that comes from sleeping in a car during a February freeze, curled into a ball beneath a cheap polyester blanket, praying the battery would have enough life to start the engine just so I could run the heater for 10 minutes. Every time the cold seeped through the glass, I thought of that silver luxury car sitting in their heated garage. I kept tabs on them through social media, a digital form of self-torture that eventually became my greatest motivation. I watched them post photos from the sun-drenched balconies of Italian villas, sipping wine and smiling as if they had never had a son at all. They looked lighter, younger, and completely unburdened by the financial drain they had discarded. There were no posts wondering where I was or if I was even alive. My mother's feed was a curated gallery of high-end home renovations and expensive galas for the local elite. They were living the dream they had bought with the money they saved by tossing me aside. That realization did something to my DNA. It turned my hurt into a cold, calculating ambition. I stopped looking for their approval and started looking for my own security. I worked until my hands bled and my eyes burned, moving from manual labor into technical sales, then into real estate investment. I didn't have a safety net, so I built a fortress. I learned how to read contracts with a hawk's eye because I knew no one was coming to save me if I failed. By the time I turned 30, I had achieved more than my father ever had, and I had done it without a single cent of family support. I bought a home that was a statement, a quiet, modern sanctuary on a hill, far away from the neighborhood where I had been left on a porch with 2 trash bags. My life was finally structured around peace, privacy, and the absolute absence of their chaos. I had deleted their phone numbers and blocked their accounts years ago, settling into a comfortable rhythm where my past was just a ghost story I told myself to stay sharp. I felt untouchable, convinced that the distance I had built was permanent. I had reached a place where I didn't even hate them anymore. I simply didn't think about them at all. I was finally at peace, enjoying a quiet Saturday morning with a coffee and the silence of my own success, until I looked out the floor-to-ceiling windows of my living room. There, blocking my driveway, was a battered, oversized moving truck parked in front of my house. The ramp was already down, and standing on the sidewalk next to a pile of mismatched boxes was my mother, looking older and desperate, clutching a worn-out handbag as she stared up at my front door. I was finally at peace until I saw a moving truck parked in front of my house, with my mother standing next to it. I walked down the driveway with a measured gait, my heart hammering a rhythm that contradicted my outward stillness. Up close, the transformation was jarring. The parents who had once radiated the polished sheen of the upper middle class looked like they had been dragged through a decade of bad decisions. My father's hair was a frantic, unwashed silver, and his designer polo shirt was stained and frayed at the collar. My mother looked brittle, her skin papery and her eyes darting around my property with a hungry, predatory intensity. There was no hello, no, I'm sorry, and certainly no, it's good to see you. Instead, my father took one look at the stone facade of my house and scoffed, as if he were personally insulted by my success. He gestured toward the moving truck and told me to help him with the heavy dresser because his back had been acting up during the drive. The sheer audacity of it felt like a physical weight in the air. I stood my ground, my hands shoved deep into my pockets to hide the fact that they were shaking. I asked them what they were doing on my property. My mother stepped forward, her voice a shrill mix of desperation and that old, familiar entitlement. She told me that things had taken a turn and that since I clearly had plenty of extra space, it was only right that they moved into the guest wing until they got back on their feet. When I didn't move, her face twisted. She began to play the only card she thought she had left, the family card. She reminded me that they were the ones who gave me life, that they had fed me and clothed me for 16 years, and that the debt of a child to a parent is never truly paid. It was a bizarre, twisted logic. They wanted credit for the bare minimum requirements of the law, ignoring the fact that they had defaulted on those same requirements the moment it became inconvenient. My father chimed in, his voice booming with a false authority that used to terrify me. He said that my success was built on the strong foundation they had provided and that, essentially, everything I owned was family property. He spoke as if my house were a communal asset and I was merely the current caretaker who had forgotten his place. He told me to stop being dramatic about the past and to start acting like a son who respected his elders. They didn't see a man who had built a life out of the ashes they left behind. They saw a bank account with a front door. They assumed that because we shared a last name, they had a legal and moral right to occupy the sanctuary I had bled to afford. The contrast was sickening. I thought of the nights I spent shivering in that rusted sedan while they were clinking wine glasses in Tuscany, and here they were, demanding the keys to my front door as if they had personally laid every brick. I told them very clearly that they weren't coming inside. My father's face turned a deep, mottled purple. He stepped closer, invading my personal space just like he used to do when I was a child. He told me that he wasn't asking for permission and that he was my father, which gave him all the permission he needed. He claimed that the law favored parents and that I couldn't legally turn away my own flesh and blood when they were in need. He actually had the nerve to call me selfish for living in such a large house while they were struggling. The entitlement was a thick, choking fog. He reached out and tried to grab my shoulder to shove me aside, his eyes fixed on the warmth of the hallway behind me. He was so certain of his dominance, so sure that the old power dynamics would hold, that he didn't even notice the shadow moving in the entryway. My father tried to push past me into the foyer, but he stopped dead when he saw the person standing behind me holding a briefcase. I led them toward the heavy oak table in the dining room, but I didn't pull out the chairs for them. I watched as they sank into the velvet upholstery, their eyes wandering over the crown molding and the designer lighting, still calculating how much of my life they could claim as their own. My father started to complain about the lack of refreshments, mentioning that they had been driving for 6 hours and a coffee would be the least I could do. I ignored him. I didn't offer water, tea, or comfort. Instead, I placed a thick, manila folder on the table between us. I told them that before we discussed their guest suite, we needed to reconcile a few outstanding line items. My father rolled his eyes, calling me petty, but his posture stiffened when I opened the folder to the first page. It wasn't a family photo or a sentimental letter. It was a comprehensive statement titled "The Cost of Survival," dated from the night of my 16th birthday. I began to read the numbers aloud, my voice flat and devoid of any warmth. I started with the medical bills from that first winter, the ones I had to pay out of pocket at a free clinic because I no longer had access to their insurance, despite them legally being required to provide it. I detailed the cost of the emergency dental work I needed after being malnourished for a year, an expense that took me 18 months to settle. My mother tried to interrupt, saying that those were just growing pains, but I silenced her by sliding the next page forward. This page covered the high-interest payday loans I was forced to take out at 18 just to cover a security deposit on a studio apartment that lacked a functional heater. I showed them the math on the compound interest, money that had vanished into the pockets of predatory lenders because I had no cosigner and no safety net. Then, I moved to the most significant figure, the lost opportunity cost. I had calculated the difference between the career trajectory of someone who enters university at 18 versus someone who has to spend 5 years working 80-hour weeks just to afford the basic tuition for a community college. I showed them the gap in lifetime earnings, a staggering 6-figure sum that was directly tied to the day they threw me out. I explained that while they were enjoying their first-class flights and Italian villas, I was paying a poverty tax that had cost me nearly a decade of my prime earning years. I pointed to the entry for the shared savings account they had drained, the one containing my teenage earnings. I had adjusted that amount for inflation, plus a modest 8% annual return, which was what that money would have earned had it been left in a standard index fund. Every time I spoke a number, the air in the room seemed to get thinner. My father tried to huff and puff, claiming that I was making things up, but I had the receipts stapled to the back of the ledger. I had kept everything. Every late fee, every collection notice, and every hospital bill was there in black and white. I told them that if they wanted to talk about the debt a child owes a parent for giving them life, we first had to settle the debt the parents incurred by intentionally sabotaging that life. I was presenting them with the bill for my suffering, itemized and audited with professional precision. I wasn't an angry child anymore. I was a creditor coming to collect on a 15-year-old default. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the sound of my mother's jagged breathing. She reached out to touch the paper, her fingers trembling as she saw the final total at the bottom of the first page. My mother started to cry, calling me heartless. So, I decided to show her what heartless actually looks like on a spreadsheet. I leaned back in my chair and watched the tears track through the heavy foundation on my mother's face. For a moment, a person who didn't know our history might have felt a flicker of pity, but all I felt was a cold curiosity. I asked them the question that had been hovering in the air like a bad smell since they arrived. Where was Julian? Julian, my younger brother, was the golden child who could do no wrong. While I was being told I was a financial drain at 16, Julian was being gifted high-end electronics and private coaching for hobbies he would abandon within a month. My mother's sobbing intensified at the mention of his name, and my father's bravado finally collapsed into a slumped, defeated posture. Slowly, The truth began to leak out, and it was even more pathetic than I had imagined. It turned out that the luxury lifestyle I had seen on social media was a house of cards built on a foundation of shifting debt. As they aged, they had poured every remaining asset, the home equity, the 401k, the proceeds from the sale of my grandmother's jewelry, into Julian's entrepreneurial ventures. They had treated him like a blue-chip stock, convinced that his charm and their constant bankrolling would eventually result in a massive payout for the whole family. 2 years ago, Julian had convinced them to sell their primary residence and invest the entire nut into a tech startup he was launching in Dubai. He told them they would be living in a penthouse by Christmas. Instead, the moment the wires cleared, Julian stopped answering his phone. He didn't just lose the money, he evaporated. He left them in a rented condo they couldn't afford, with nothing but the clothes on their backs and a mountain of credit card debt they had taken out in their own names to bridge the gap for him. They had spent the last 6 months being evicted from one cheap motel after another, watching their remaining dignity vanish in the rearview mirror. As I listened, the final piece of the puzzle clicked into place. They hadn't come to my house because they missed me or because they finally realized the magnitude of what they had done to me. They came because the golden child had stripped them bare and left them for dead. I wasn't a son to them. I was a contingency plan. I was the insurance policy they had previously tried to cancel, now being reactivated because the primary beneficiary had committed fraud. The realization should have hurt, but it was actually liberating. It confirmed that their love was entirely transactional. They only valued a child based on what that child could provide for them. When I was 16 and required investment, I was a liability. Now that I was 31 and possessed assets, I was family again. They sat there, two people who had gambled their entire future on a favorite and lost, now looking at the one they had discarded as if I were a winning lottery ticket they had accidentally found in an old coat pocket. My father had the audacity to suggest that Julian was troubled and that we all needed to band together to recover the family legacy. He was still trying to frame their catastrophic failure as a collective responsibility. He actually expected me to work for the benefit of the brother who had enjoyed the childhood I was denied, and to house the parents who had prioritized that brother's greed over my survival. They were begging for a room not out of love, but out of a lack of options. They had gone to every friend, every distant cousin, and every bridge they hadn't yet burned, and I was the very last stop on a long road of rejections. I looked at the two of them, broken, desperate, and still fundamentally incapable of taking responsibility, and I felt a strange sense of gratitude toward Julian. By robbing them blind, he had stripped away the last of their pretenses. But the brother wasn't just gone. I found out where the money actually went, and it involved a secret my parents had been hiding since I was 16. I reached into the folder and pulled out the second packet, a spreadsheet that looked more like a corporate forensic audit than a personal ledger. If Phase 1 was about the tangible costs of my survival, Phase 2 was the deep dive into the psychological and systemic debt they had accrued through 15 years of calculated neglect. I set the pages down with a deliberate click of my wedding ring against the table, a sound that seemed to make my father flinch. I told them that we were moving past the simple bills and into the territory of compound emotional interest. I had calculated a rent-for-life figure, a conceptual but mathematically grounded number representing the decade and a half they had spent living in a world where they didn't have to be parents. I explained that by discarding me, they had essentially saved themselves the equivalent of a second mortgage every month, money they had used to fund their vacations, their wine clubs, and Julian's endless failures. I had taken the average cost of raising a child in our zip code, adjusted it for the premium lifestyle they insisted on maintaining, and applied a conservative 5% inflation rate for every year I was gone. I pointed to a column titled "The Safety Net Premium." I told them that having a family to fall back on has a measurable financial value in the real world. It allows for risk-taking, lower insurance premiums, and mental health stability. Since they had denied me that safety net, I had been forced to pay risk premiums on everything I did. I added the cost of every therapist I had seen to process the night of my 16th birthday, and the cost of the career coach I needed to learn the social cues they never bothered to teach me. I was presenting them with a bill for life, that had climbed well into the mid-six-figure range. My father leaned forward, his eyes scanning the numbers with a mix of confusion and mounting rage. He called the document a work of fiction, a delusional fantasy cooked up to hurt them. I didn't raise my voice. I simply pointed to a line item labeled the 2016 inheritance diversion. I revealed that I knew about the trust my grandfather had set up for all his grandchildren, a trust they had quietly liquidated and reinvested into Julian's failed luxury car wash business when I was 19 and starving. I had tracked the legal filings. They hadn't just kicked me out, they had actively stolen my future to cushion the golden child's present. I showed them the math on what that trust would be worth today if it had remained untouched in a standard brokerage account. The total at the bottom of the page was enough to buy a second home in this neighborhood in cash. I told them that this wasn't just about hurt feelings, it was about a 15-year history of financial and emotional embezzlement. I watched as my mother's eyes glazed over, the sheer scale of the debt of neglect finally sinking in. She tried to argue that family doesn't keep score, but I reminded her that they were the ones who started the game when they labeled a 16-year-old boy a financial drain. They had set the rules of engagement in that doorway 15 years ago, and I was simply finishing the match. I told them that the room they were sitting in, the air they were breathing in my home, and the very clothes on my back were assets they had no claim to because they had voluntarily forfeited their shares in my life. I was treating them with the same cold, corporate efficiency they had shown me. I wasn't their son in this moment. I was a liquidator closing out a bankrupt estate. The audit showed that even if I handed them the keys to my house today, it wouldn't even cover the interest on the damage they had caused. I saw my father's face shift from defeat back into a desperate, cornered aggression. He didn't have an argument, so he resorted to the only thing he had left: noise. He stood up so quickly his chair screeched against the hardwood floor, a sound like a dying animal. He looked around my pristine dining room, at the art on the walls and the high-end finishes, and his entitlement flared up one last time like a dying ember. He screamed that I was a monster, that no real son would ever put a price tag on his own parents' suffering, and that I was legally obligated to provide for them under the laws of common decency. He was gasping for air, his face a terrifying shade of crimson as he realized that his power over me had not just waned, it had been systematically dismantled and replaced by a pile of indisputable paperwork. He was trapped in a house he couldn't afford, owned by a person he didn't recognize, facing a debt he could never pay. My dad slammed his fist on the table and screamed that I couldn't do this. I told him he was right. I wasn't doing it. The bank was. I reached for my phone on the table and tapped the speaker icon, placing a call that I had scheduled the moment I saw their moving truck enter the neighborhood. The line crackled for a second before a weary, gravelly voice filled the room. It was Mr. Henderson, the man who had lived in the house directly across from ours for 30 years. My father's eyes widened, recognition dawning on him like a slow-moving storm. I asked Mr. Henderson to repeat what he had told me during our lunch meeting 3 months ago. There was a heavy pause, the kind of silence that holds the weight of a decade of suppressed truth. He began to describe the night of my 16th birthday from his perspective, and the details were even more chilling than my own memories. He talked about standing at his front window, watching as my father practically threw me onto the sidewalk. He described the way my mother had watched from the porch, checking her appearance in the glass of the door while her son stood in the rain with 2 trash bags. But then came the part one hadn't known. Mr. Henderson's voice trembled with a mix of age and old, simmering anger as he explained that he had actually started to walk across the street that night to offer me his spare bedroom. He hadn't even made it halfway across the pavement before my father intercepted him. My father had stood in the middle of the street and threatened him, stating that if he stepped foot on the property or offered me so much as a sandwich, he would use his influence on the local zoning board to make sure Mr. Henderson's small home business was shut down for good. He had told the neighbor that I was a delinquent and a thief, and that anyone who helped me was an accomplice to my crimes. My father sat across from me now, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water, but no sound came out. Mr. Henderson didn't stop there. He spoke about the years that followed, about how he had watched my parents host lavish parties and park new cars in the driveway, all while he wondered if I was even alive. He told my parents, directly through the phone, that they were the biggest monsters he had ever encountered in his 70 years on this earth. He said he had kept a written log of the dates and times he saw them mistreating me, just in case a lawyer ever came knocking. The room felt like it was vibrating with the force of his testimony. It wasn't just my word against theirs anymore. I wasn't the bitter, imaginative son they tried to paint me as. I had a witness, a respected member of the community who had seen the raw, unedited version of their cruelty. This was the third-party validation that stripped away their last shred of plausible deniability. They couldn't gaslight me into believing it wasn't that bad when a neighbor was describing the scene like a police report. My mother tried to whimpering that Mr. Henderson always had a grudge against them, but her voice was hollow, lacking any conviction. She knew the truth was out. I thanked Mr. Henderson and hung up, the silence that followed feeling even more absolute than before. I looked at my parents, who were now shrinking into their seats as if the very walls were closing in on them. They were no longer the powerful gatekeepers of my life. They were two people caught in a spotlight of their own making. They had spent 15 years pretending that night never happened, but the world had been watching. The neighbor's testimony was the final nail in the coffin of their perfect family narrative. It proved that their neglect wasn't a mistake or a lapse in judgment. It was a calculated, enforced isolation. With the neighbor's statement in my hand, I had enough for the final move in this game. I reached into the folder one last time and pulled out a document with a blue court seal. The paper was crisp, a sharp contrast to the wrinkled, stained sleeves of my father's shirt. I didn't slide it toward them. I held it up so they could see the bold heading. I explained that I wasn't just refusing to host a family reunion. I told them that 3 days ago, the moment I received a frantic, entitled voicemail from my mother demanding my address, I had gone to the courthouse. This was a temporary restraining order and a petition for a permanent no-contact injunction. My father tried to laugh, a hollow, rattling sound, claiming that no judge would ever grant such a thing against a man's own parents. I let him finish before I pointed to the attached exhibits. I had included the police report from the night I was 16, the neighbor's sworn affidavit, and a transcript of their recent messages which were filled with threats to ruin my reputation if I didn't pay up. I explained that in the eyes of the law, they weren't parents. They were a documented threat to my peace and safety. I told them that the police were already aware of the moving truck parked in my driveway and that if they weren't off my property within 20 minutes, they wouldn't be looking for a guest room, they would be looking for a bail bondsman. My mother's face went white, the reality of the legal wall finally hitting her. She realized that the doors weren't just closed, they were barricaded by the state. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small, folded piece of paper. I didn't give them money, and I didn't offer them a map to the nearest hotel. I handed them a printed list of local homeless shelters, including one that specialized in displaced seniors. I told them that since they were so fond of telling 16-year-olds to figure it out, they now had the perfect opportunity to practice what they preached. I saw my father's hands start to shake as he looked at the addresses of the shelters. The entitlement was gone, replaced by a cold, sharp terror. They were finally standing on the other side of the ledge they had pushed me off so many years ago. They had no assets, no friends, and now they had no son. I reminded them that the man they told me to become at 16 was standing right in front of them, and that man didn't owe a single cent to the people who tried to break him. The air in the room felt lighter as the power dynamic finally shattered into 1,000 pieces. They were no longer the architects of my world. They were just two trespassers waiting for the clock to run out. My mother collapsed back into her chair, her voice cracking as she wailed, "How could you do this to your own blood?" My response was a single sentence that silenced the entire room. The silence following my response was so thick it felt like it had its own heartbeat. My parents didn't leave quietly. They left with the frantic, desperate energy of people who knew they were finally losing their grip on a narrative they had spent 15 years perfecting. As they pulled that battered moving truck away from my curb, I saw my mother's phone glowing in the dark of the cab. Within an hour, the first strike landed. She had taken to Facebook, posting a tear-streaked selfie in front of my closed gates with a caption that painted me as a cold-hearted millionaire who had turned his elderly, homeless parents away into the night. She used words like abandonment and cruelty, tagging every mutual family friend and former neighbor we had ever known. She was trying to weaponize the community, hoping that public shame would succeed where their private demands had failed. For a few hours, the comments were a storm of indignation from people who only knew the curated version of our family history. But I was ready. I didn't engage in a shouting match, and I didn't send angry private messages. I simply opened my laptop and posted a public response that ended the conversation forever. I uploaded the audit, the itemized spreadsheet of the hundreds of thousands of dollars they had cost me through their neglect and theft. I attached the scanned copy of my grandfather's liquidated trust and, most importantly, the audio recording of Mr. Henderson's testimony. I didn't add much commentary. I let the data speak for itself. I captioned it, 15 years ago, I was told to figure it out on my own. I did. This is the bill. The reversal was instantaneous and devastating. The same community members who had been liking my mother's post began to delete their comments. Mr. Henderson himself weighed in, confirming every word and adding details about the threats my father had made to the neighborhood. The Saint masks my parents wore didn't just slip, they were incinerated. By morning, my mother had deactivated her account. But the final blow didn't come from me. As the post went viral in our hometown circles, someone recognized the name Julian in the comments. A former classmate of his posted a series of photos taken just 48 hours prior. While my parents were begging for a room in my house and claiming Julian had disappeared with their money, Julian was tagged at a high-end resort in Miami. He was lounging poolside, holding a cocktail that probably cost more than my parents' current net worth, surrounded by a group of people who looked as vacuous as he was. He hadn't just taken their retirement, he was flaunting it. He hadn't even bothered to change his name or hide his location because he knew my parents were too ashamed and too protective of their golden child to ever call the police. Seeing those photos side by side with the image of my parents in their rusted truck was the ultimate audit of their lives. They had sacrificed the son who would have actually cared for them at the altar of the son who viewed them as nothing more than an ATM. The community didn't just turn on them, they became a punchline, a cautionary tale about the high cost of playing favorites and the eventual bankruptcy of a life built on lies. My father tried to call me one last time, likely to beg me to take down the post, but I had already blocked the number. There was nothing left to negotiate. The truth was out in the world, and it was a fire they couldn't put out. I sat on my porch and watched the sunset, feeling a strange sense of stillness. I had spent 15 years running away from that night on the porch, and in one evening, I had circled back and conquered it. The debt was settled, not because they had paid me back in cash, but because they were finally forced to see themselves through the eyes of the world. They had wanted a room in my house, but they ended up with a front-row seat to their own destruction. They left my porch that night, but as I watched them walk toward their rusted car, I realized the most satisfying part of my revenge wasn't the money. The house is quiet now, a silence that doesn't feel lonely, but earned. I sat in my living room tonight, watching the shadows of the trees dance across the walls I bought with my own sweat, and I felt a lightness I haven't known since I was 15 years old. For half my life, I carried the weight of being the family mistake, a title my parents pinned to my chest before they pushed me out the door. I used to think my success was a way to prove them wrong, but I realized tonight that proving them wrong still kept them at the center of my story. The real victory wasn't the house, the car, or the public vindication. It was the moment I realized that I am not a mistake at all. I am the family conclusion. I am the end of a long, jagged line of entitlement, manipulation, and conditional love. By saying no, I didn't just protect my assets, I protected the person I fought so hard to become. I broke a cycle that had likely been spinning for generations, fueled by the lie that blood is a blank check for abuse. It isn't. Blood is just biology. Family is a choice you make every day through respect and reliability. To anyone listening who feels the crushing weight of a toxic legacy, know this. Your life does not belong to the people who gave it to you if they refuse to cherish it. You have the right to build a wall. You have the right to perform an audit of your soul and decide who is truly worth the investment. Choosing yourself isn't selfish, it's a necessary act of justice. My parents are gone now, drifting toward whatever destination their choices have earned them, and for the first time, I don't feel the need to look out the window to see where they went. I've deleted the spreadsheets and closed the folder. I am finally living in the present, in a home that is actually a sanctuary. But the world has a funny way of making sure stories don't end quite as neatly as we want them to. They're still sending letters from a motel. Should I read the one where my brother finally calls them?